Frank Herbert's Dune was first published as a novel in 1965, and it forever changed the sci-fi genre. It went on to sell 20 million copies, making it the best-selling science fiction novel of all time, and it became a major influence for massive later franchises like Star Wars and the Warhammer 40k tabletop games. Technology takes a back seat in a universe of political subterfuge which interweaves philosophy, religion and ecology alongside exploration of human nature and destiny. Historical influences are also apparent, from medieval fiefdoms through to Cold War politics. There's been many attempts to turn the epic novel into films and television series since the 1970s. The task of adapting a near 200,000 word sci-fi novel set on a desert world filled with monstrous sandworms and huge battle scenes proved too much for earlier filmmakers, with Chilean director Alejandro Jodorowsky's Dune running out of money before it was finished, and David Lynch's 1984 attempt being a critical misfire. It was only in 2021, through director Denis Villeneuve, that the Dune universe finally reached commercial and critical acclaim on film, and this version grossed over $400 million and won 6 Academy Awards. Its sequel, Dune Part 2, has just landed. Villeneuve's 2 Dune films are closely based on Herbert's first Dune novel, and for this video I wanted to explore some of the historical themes and influences that enrich this epic story. So let's delve into the history behind Dune. Before we start, it's worth running through a basic plot summary of the first Dune novel and the 2 latest films, without giving you too many spoilers. It's useful then to hang the history on that story. Dune is set 20,000 years into the future and tells the story of Paul Atreides. The Atreides are a powerful noble family within an interplanetary imperium, and they're assigned the fiefdom of the desert planet Arrakis, the only source of the important spice melange. However, the rival Harkonnen seize control of Arrakis, assassinating Paul's father, and force the surviving Atreides to flee into the desert. Paul and his mother, Lady Jessica, are taken in by the Fremen, a group of desert dwellers who live on Arrakis. Paul adapts to the Fremen way of life and begins to embrace his destiny as their prophesied leader. He leads the Fremen against the Harkonnens and eventually claims control over Arrakis. That's a nice brief plot summary, and we can take the history from here. Let's start with the inspiration and historical context for the creation of Dune. Frank Herbert's research for Dune began in earnest in 1957 when he was working as a journalist. He was assigned to write an article about a Department of Agriculture experiment which sought to use poverty grasses to stabilise sand dunes, and so he travelled to the Oregon dunes in the northwest of the United States. Herbert was awestruck by their size. They're some of the biggest in the world, reaching up to 500 metres in height, and he noted they could swallow whole cities, lakes, rivers and highways. In some ways, the genesis of Dune was an ecological study. The end of the 1950s saw a shift to a more affluent and consumerist society in the West, and mankind's threat to the environment was becoming increasingly apparent. During his upbringing in West Washington, Herbert was also close to Native American cultures and was influenced by a Ho man named Henry Martin, who showed him the ways of his people. He also became best friends with environmentalist Howard Hansen, who once warned him, based on what a Native American friend had said, that white men are eating the earth. They're going to turn this whole planet into a wasteland, just like North Africa. Herbert later agreed, saying that the whole world would become a big Dune. While not drawn in by the counterculture hippie movement that grew in California, where he lived in the 1960s, Frank Herbert did take psychedelics and cultivated his own magic mushrooms. For some people, the use of psychedelics like mushrooms and LSD in the 1960s gave rise to questions about the possible expansion of human consciousness. From 1960 to 62, Harvard professor Timothy Leary conducted the Harvard psilocybin project with the belief that it could help in the realms of psychiatry. While Dr. Leary was fired by Harvard in 1963, he had interactions with personalities of counterculture, such as the beat poet Allen Ginsberg, who joined in some of the experiments. The expansion of human consciousness is the key attribute of the drug spice or melange. In Dune, spice is the most valuable resource in the known universe, and it's also vital for interstellar travel. This key plot device is rooted in Herbert's own experiences with mushroom trips. The early 1960s was also when Cold War tensions and the nuclear arms race between the US and the USSR were reaching their height, arguably peaking in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. The two superpowers were jockeying for political influence and alignment all over the world, but one major flashpoint was the Arab world of the Middle East and its rich oil reserves. Arrakis, the planet where Dune is set, is basically the Arab world. You can even hear the similarity in the words. While consuming oil doesn't lead to superhuman abilities, it remains integral to many forms of travel. It was the most important natural resource of the mid-20th century. Frank Herbert's son and biographer Brian said this about that particular allegory. Dune is a modern-day conglomeration of familiar myths, a tale in which great sandworms guard a precious treasure of melange, the geriatric spice that represents, among other things, the finite resource of oil. At the heart of Dune's plot is the battle for Arrakis between the imperial houses of the Harkonnens and the Atreides. In David Lynch's Dune, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen proclaims, "He who controls Arrakis controls the spice, and he who controls the spice controls the universe." This is actually an addition to the original novel, but it sums up the struggle rather well. Ultimately, Dune is a story of human greed and the power that's granted by access to important resources. The superpower proxy conflict in the Middle East has been labelled a form of neo-imperialism because neither the United States nor the USSR were officially an empire. But the region had been under imperial control and influence for centuries. The western region of Palestine and the Levant had been under Ottoman control for more than 400 years, until the conclusion of World War I, when it was subsumed under French and British administrations through a League of Nations mandate. Britain had also ruled Egypt until 1922 and invaded Iran during World War II to gain access to its oil resources. The 1950s saw the waning of British interests in the Middle East, and British assets such as the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and the Suez Canal being nationalised. This led to military intervention and political meddling. The Egyptian president during the Suez Crisis, Abdel Nasser, had been advocating pan-Arab nationalism, essentially a uniting of the Arab states, partially as an attempt to end Western interference in the Arab world. While Egyptian unification with Syria was achieved in 1958, and a separate Arab federation was formed between Jordan and Iraq the same year, both attempts were short-lived and ended by military coup d'etat in Syria and Iraq respectively. The quest for Arab unity and the ending of imperial influence has parallels with the inhabitants of Arrakis, the Fremen, who don't see themselves as imperial subjects and who oppose House Harkonnen's fiefdom of the planet through guerrilla warfare. The imperial fiefdom keeps these apparently few people subjugated, while the Harkonnens mine the spice on Arrakis. But by the time House Atreides arrives on Dune, the Fremen are more numerous than the Harkonnen believed, and they're extremely hardy fighters, partly due to living close to spice and the superhuman qualities it brings, in their native environment. The historical basis of the Fremen is the nomadic Bedouins, largely Muslim tribes who have been present in the Middle East since the founding of Islam in the 7th century. The Fremen have many customs and rituals that dismiss Western individualism and espouse the tribe. This is illustrated through the Fremen's sharing of water, a scant resource on a desert world. A man's flesh is his own, one Fremen says. The water belongs to the tribe. There are also numerous references in Dune to the Arabic language. Paul Atreides is first labelled Usul by the Fremen after passing his first test, which means pillar to the Fremen, but translates as fundamental principles in Arabic. His later moniker of Muad'Dib refers to a desert mouse due to Paul's slight physical features, but in Arabic it means educator. The giant sandworms, the huge native creatures who produce spice and rule over the desert, are occasionally referred to as Say Khulud, or immortal thing, when translated from Arabic. In Paul's later leading of the Fremen, the word jihad is used to define his struggle against the Harkonnens and their future interplanetary campaign. The basic Arab definition of jihad is a struggle against the enemies of Islam. Herbert was also influenced by ancient Middle Eastern cultures and the fact that this desert region had led to the foundation of major religions with prophets and messiah figures. A prophet is a human messenger sent by God, often with the ability to see into the future. A messiah is the promised deliverer of the Jewish nation, as prophesied in the Hebrew Bible, and in less religious terms, is the saviour of a group or nation. In Dune, the arrival of the Messiah comes in two forms or belief systems. The first is in the Fremen belief in the Lisan al-Gaib, which means the voice from the outer world, who will lead the Fremen to freedom by defeating the Imperium, help them terraform the desert planet into a fertile one, and then lead them on a jihad. The second belief system is through the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, of which Paul's mother, Lady Jessica, is a member. This is all subtext, but the sisterhood seeks through a multi-generational breeding program between the noble houses to create the Kwisatz Haderach. In Hebrew, this means shortening of the way. The Kwisatz Haderach would be a male Bene Gesserit who would be able to see into the future through prescient understanding, as well as having access to the memories of all his male and female ancestors. Essentially, a superhuman with access to all of history and all the possibilities of the future. It's worth getting into some of the history behind the Bene Gesserit here too. Gesserit sounds pretty close to Jesuit, a Roman Catholic order founded in 1540, and Frank Herbert had strong Catholic influences in his upbringing. The Kwisatz Haderach also has its influences in medieval beliefs in hereditary lineage. One parallel is the claim that Jesus secretly married Mary Magdalene and that she fled to Europe with his son after the crucifixion. The Merovingian kings who ruled over the Frankish kingdoms during the 5th to the 8th centuries claimed lineage back to Christ. These spurious claims were also made by other medieval monarchs for hundreds of years. Apparently, they're all descended from the Messiah. Bit of a spoiler alert here, but the Fremen see Paul Atreides as the Lisan al-Gaib, as seen when he first arrives on Arrakis in Dune Part 1, while it's later found out, via a plot twist that we won't ruin here, that he must also be the Kwisatz Haderach. There's also a slightly less abstract historical influence of Paul as a foreigner leading the desert people against their imperial oppressors. T.E. Laurence, better known as Laurence of Arabia, assisted the Arab revolt in overthrowing the Ottoman Empire during World War I. Laurence entered active service in the Middle Eastern theatre in 1916. He formed a close relationship with Faisal, the Emir of Mecca, and believed in Faisal's vision of an independent Arab state. Together, they created a formidable alliance that helped to drive the Ottomans out of Arabia. In June, if any character could be Faisal, then it would be Stilgar, played by Javier Bardem. Britain originally supported Arab independence in exchange for support against the Ottomans, but quickly reneged on their promises through the secret 1916 Sykes-Picot Agreement, which divided the Middle East into French and British spheres of influence. To complicate matters further, Britain also promised the Jews a homeland in Palestine with the Balfour Declaration. Remember that pan-Arab nationalism wanted to unify Arab interests and end Western meddling. While Arab independence failed after World War I, the exhausted French and British empires withdrew from the region after World War II. Arab unity was never achieved, but had it been, this supranational state would have initially had a population of some 100 million people, and by far the most oil reserves in the world. Since the 1960s, Islamic countries have also had the world's highest birth rate. The population of the region has now reached something like 450 million. Such a large territory with access to natural resources and a large population would create another major power bloc in the world, similar in population size to Europe and the USA. But continuing external power meddling, both from the West and the Soviet Union, deepened divisions in the Arab world and prevented it from happening. Another major factor was a split within the Arab world itself, creating its own regional Cold War. Secular republics, such as Egypt, found themselves in opposition to more conservative monarchies, such as Saudi Arabia and Morocco. These divisions became more complex when the Iranian monarchy was overthrown by a fundamentalist regime in 1979, creating a split between the Shia, Iran and Iraq, and the largely Sunni majority nations around them. Back to Dune, and the Fremen are hardy fighters but are unable to overthrow the imperial houses until their Messiah arrives and unifies the tribes. As he becomes their leader, Paul adopts the identity of Muad'Dib. This transition marks Paul as a kind of master of two worlds, of both noble imperial lineage and the desert ways. Laurence of Arabia was known for adopting Arabic customs, but another historical figure who acted similarly was the ancient Greek warlord Alexander the Great. Through his conquest of the Achaemenid Empire, completed by 330 BC, Alexander learned Persian traditions and encouraged the intermarrying of his generals with Persian women to assimilate his new territory. Paul takes a Fremen concubine, Chani, as Alexander did, but there are further parallels too. Both Paul and Alexander's fathers were great men who laid the foundations for their sons to become even bigger heroes than themselves. Both of their fathers were assassinated when the heroes were teenagers. Both have influential mothers who were members of religious sects. Finally, both leaders defeat their long-term rivals in the desert. Paul leads the Fremen and Atreides against the Harkonnens. Alexander led the Macedonian Greeks to defeat the Achaemenid Persians. The name Atreides is directly borrowed from Greek mythology. Atreus was the father of Agamemnon and Menelaus, both of whom could be referred to as Atreides, the male descendants of Atreus. These two characters led the Greek forces in Homer's Iliad and the Trojan War. Duke Leto's name is also borrowed from Greek myth. Leto was a goddess and mother to Apollo via Zeus. The name Apollo doesn't sound a million miles away from the name Paul, and Apollo was a god of truth and prophecy, amongst other things. Paul gains the power of prescient understanding through which he can see the future, seeing millions of possibilities, all enhanced by spice, the LSD of Dune. Thus, like Apollo, he becomes a near deity of truth and prophecy. Returning to the Cold War situation of the Middle East, Frank Herbert appears to have chosen the names of the two houses based on current affairs. House Harkonnen are the villains of the story, and Herbert confirmed he was seeking a Soviet-sounding name so that readers would associate them as the enemy. He found a Finnish name, Harkonnen, instead, which he felt fitted well. Herbert was strongly opposed to the Soviet Union and was in fact a distant relative of Senator Joseph McCarthy, famous for his crackdown of suspected communists in American public life. So why did Herbert use a Greek name for the good guys, although arguably Herbert didn't see the Atreides as the good guys? But he could be referring to the Greeks as the foundation civilization of the modern West. The classical Greeks influenced the Romans, who in turn had influence on European civilization, of which America became an extension. So Herbert could be alluding to the battle between the West and the Soviet Union in the Middle East. But there, the historical comparison starts to fade away. The Soviets actually backed the Arabs against Israel and their primarily American allies. In Dune, the Atreides unite with the Fremen, who are the Arabs. Indeed, there's no sense of Israel in the plot of Dune at all. These noble houses need a little more explanation too. The political system in Dune is an interplanetary empire where power is shared in three ways. Firstly, via the imperial house, Corrino, at the head of which is the Padisha Emperor Shaddam IV, and whose interests are protected by a powerful military force, the Sardaukar. Then there's the Landsraad, which is an assembly of noble houses. Herbert himself said that Landsraad is an old Scandinavian word for an assembly of landowners. The houses of Atreides and Harkonnen are rivals within this body. The third main power is the Spacing Guild, which has a monopoly on interstellar travel. This system has some parallels to the feudalism of the Holy Roman Empire in medieval and early modern Germany. Herbert believed that feudalism was a natural form of government for humans to adopt because of an inclination in people not to push for leadership positions, but rather to just follow orders. The Imperium is not an omnipotent force. Indeed, it's weakened by the near-autonomous houses that maintain their own militaries, along with powerful economic forces like the guilds. And the Emperor is politically reliant on the support of these houses. In this way, it's similar to the warring houses of Game of Thrones, the fantasy medieval series. Another slightly back-to-front concept of Dune, pointing again to the medieval era, is in the lack of projectile weaponry. Why does everyone fight with blades? This isn't well explained in Dune Part 1. The details of this are a little bit geeky, but it's basically because soldiers wear force field shields that can deflect fast-moving projectile weapons, but don't have the same level of defence against much slower thrusts and stabs. The Sardaukar, the Emperor's crack troops, have similarities to the knife-wielding Ottoman Janissaries, the first modern standing army, not to mention an imperial power overthrown by Arab forces. The apparent regression of weaponry may seem odd, but an interesting historical parallel is the infantry helmet. Although this had been rendered largely obsolete by the widespread use of gunpowder weapons by the 18th century, it was brought back during World War I due to shrapnel artillery. Similarly, there are no computers in Dune. All the technology is analogue, and the awkward-looking ornithopters are an illustration of this. From where we are in the 2020s, we can't imagine future flight transport looking like that. But Herbert uses a device to avoid technology convoluting the plot. 10,000 years before the events of the novel and the films, there was a revolution against thinking machines, such as computers and artificial intelligence, called the Butlerian Jihad, which is also the title of a later novel in the Dune series. The name Butler refers to the English novelist Samuel Butler and an essay he wrote entitled Darwin Amongst the Machines, which proposed that machines might develop consciousness. At the time of publication in 1863, that must have appeared ludicrous, but by the 1960s, Herbert was already thinking it was necessary to regress technology in a sci-fi novel. After the successful destruction of thinking machines, a commandment in the Dune universe reads, "Thou shalt not make a machine with the likeness of a human mind. Frank Herbert, like his hero Paul Atreides, seemed to have a prescient understanding of the future, as if war with the machines is inevitable. From Terminator to The Matrix, the war against the machines trope has appeared as science fiction, but now it's an idea that doesn't seem so far distant from reality. And thus, with the consideration of that future, or perhaps we might even say present, our history of Dune is concluded. Thanks for watching this video on the history of Dune. The Dune universe is vast and spans a total of 28 novels, so we can't squeeze it all into one video, but we did our best to cover off some of the main themes. Make sure you like this video and subscribe to our channel, and you can also head over to historyhit.com/subscribe to get all of our documentaries and podcasts ad-free.